She thought he was just a drifter cowboy, but he owned half the state and hadn't loved in years. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the vast Colorado mountains, painting the sky in strokes of gold and violet, when Emma Calloway first saw him. He was leaning against the hitching post outside her family's rundown diner, dust covering his boots, a battered Stetson tilted low over his face. To anyone else, he was just another drifter, another cowboy with no home and no past, looking for a hot meal and maybe a place to sleep before riding off to the next dusty town. Emma had grown used to the type. Her father, God rest his soul, used to say that a town like Fair Creek was built on the backs of dreamers and drifters. But she'd learned, the hard way, that trusting strangers usually led to heartache. She tightened the knot of her apron and stepped outside, preparing to shoo him away before he scared off what few customers she had left. "Sir, if you're looking for work, we ain't hiring," she called, her voice sharper than she intended. The man looked up, and for a split second, their eyes locked. His were a stormy gray, lined with years of unsaid words and unseen battles. He simply tipped his hat politely and said, "Wasn't looking for work, ma'am. Just needed a cup of coffee." Emma hesitated. Something in his voice, gentle but worn, made her pause. Against her better judgment, she nodded toward the door. "Well, coffee's $1. Sit where you like." He walked in without a word, his spurs clinking softly against the wood floors. Emma watched him for a moment longer than necessary, an odd tug pulling at her heart. Over the next few days, he kept showing up. Always sitting at the corner booth, always ordering just coffee. Emma learned his name was Luke. Nothing else. No last name. No story. She figured he was running from something, weren't they all, in one way or another? Emma had her own burdens. After her parents passed, she was left to run the diner and care for her little brother, Josh. Money was tight, and the bank was breathing down her neck about overdue payments. Every day was a battle between pride and desperation, and every night she whispered prayers into the cracks of the old ceiling, hoping someone, anyone, was listening. One evening, just as the last customer shuffled out into the cold, Luke stayed behind. He offered to help her stack chairs without being asked. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though each small act of kindness was a way of making peace with something heavy on his soul. "You don't talk much," Emma said as they worked side by side. Luke chuckled, a sound so soft it barely stirred the air. "Reckon I said all I had to say a long time ago." There was a sadness to him, deep and wide, and it whispered to the loneliness Emma carried in her own heart. As weeks turned into months, the townsfolk started whispering about the stranger at Calloway's diner. Some said he was an outlaw. Others claimed he was hiding from a past too shameful to name. Emma didn't much care. She saw the way he slipped extra dollars into the tip jar when he thought she wasn't looking, or how he bought new boots for Josh and left them by the door without a name. Luke never asked for anything in return. And in a town where most folks only helped if there was something in it for them, that kind of selflessness was rarer than rain in July. One stormy afternoon, when the river swelled and flooded the lower fields, Emma got a call that shook her to her core. Josh had gone missing while helping a neighbor move cattle to higher ground. Panic gripped her so fiercely she could hardly breathe. She didn't think, didn't plan. She just ran out into the downpour, her boots slipping in the mud as she screamed his name into the roaring wind. It was Luke who found her, collapsed near the riverbank, soaked to the bone and shivering with fear. Without a word, he hauled her up onto his horse and rode fast and hard into the raging night. Hours blurred into an endless nightmare of water and darkness. Emma clung to him, feeling the steady thump of his heart, drawing strength from his calm. Finally, by some miracle, they found Josh clinging to a tree branch, the floodwaters swirling hungrily below. Luke didn't hesitate. He leapt into the freezing water, fighting the current with a strength that seemed almost impossible. When he dragged Josh to safety, Emma dropped to her knees and sobbed, her whole body racked with gratitude and relief. Luke stayed silent, just setting a comforting hand on her shoulder before quietly leading them home. It was that night, as Emma wrapped Josh in blankets and stoked the fire, that she saw something she hadn't before, a tattoo on Luke's arm, half hidden by his soaked shirt sleeve. A brand she recognized, a symbol of the Rocking Our Ranch, the biggest and richest spread in the state. Confused, she did what any stubborn woman would do, she started asking questions. The truth, when it came, hit harder than any flood. Luke wasn't a drifter. He wasn't a runaway or an outlaw. He was Luke Remington, heir to the Rocking Our Fortune. After a family feud gone horribly wrong, he'd walked away from everything, money, power, land, and lived for years among the very people he'd once ruled over, searching for something he couldn't name and couldn't buy. "I lost myself," he admitted one evening as they sat by the fire, Josh asleep upstairs. "Lost everything that mattered. So I figured, maybe if I lived like a nobody, maybe I'd find something real again." Emma listened, heart pounding, as he told her about the love he once had, and the loss that hollowed him out. About betrayals and regrets and a loneliness so deep it had nearly swallowed him whole. "I haven't loved anyone in a long time, Emma," he said quietly, looking at her with those storm-gray eyes. "Not till now. It would have been easy to be angry. Easy to feel betrayed by the lie of omission. But Emma had learned something about love. It wasn't about money or power. It wasn't about appearances. It was about showing up, about choosing to stay when everything else said run. And Luke, he had stayed. In the months that followed, Luke used his resources quietly, anonymously, to help Fair Creek. He rebuilt the flooded fields. Paid off old debts. Fixed up the diner so it was the shining heart of town once again. But he never took credit. He never wanted the spotlight. He did it because he could, because somewhere along the way, he'd remembered that wealth wasn't meant to be hoarded. It was meant to be shared. And Emma, she found that loving him was as natural as breathing. It wasn't the grand gestures that won her heart. It was the small things, the way he read to Josh at night, the way he fixed the squeaky step without being asked, the way he held her hand like it was the most precious thing in the world. The townsfolk came around too. They saw the man beneath the mystery, the heart beneath the silence. And slowly, Fair Creek became a town of second chances, not just for Luke, but for everyone who dared to hope again. One summer evening, under a sky blazing with stars, Luke knelt by the old oak tree behind the diner, the same tree where he'd first truly seen Emma, and asked her to marry him. He didn't promise her a mansion or diamonds or riches. He promised her a home. A family. A life built not on money, but on love, trust, and shared dreams. Emma, with tears shining in her eyes, said yes without hesitation. And so it was that a woman who thought she had nothing but a crumbling diner and a broken heart found herself loved beyond measure by a man who had everything, but had been empty until he found her. Together, they built something greater than land or legacy. They built a life rooted in kindness, grown strong by selflessness, and lit by the quiet, steady power of humanity at its very best. Because sometimes, the greatest treasures are not the ones we seek, but the ones we find when we dare to open our hearts.